Okay guys, so in the previous videos we learned some theory. What different frequencies sound like and how the human ear hears different frequencies at different volumes, things like that. It's very important you get all that down. But now let's look at equalizers, everything to do with it, right? Now before we start, I just want to say two things. One, this is not going to be a short video, okay? But if you really want to learn about this, you know how I teach. I go in a certain amount and I explain things so that even an idiot like me can understand them. But I don't go so deep that it's irrelevant. Okay? So we're going to learn a lot of interesting things in this. Second thing, I'm going to be using logic a lot in this tutorial, but this has got nothing to do with logic. Okay? This video is all about equalizers, right? Doesn't matter if you're using Cubase, Logic, Pro Tools, Sonar, Reaper, Studio One, it doesn't matter. Or if you're using a hardware studio with, you know, EQ boxes or EQ on your mixing channels, on your mixing desk, right? This is nothing to do with Logic, we're just learning about equalizers. Okay, so we've got a lot to look at, but you know how I do it. Buckle up, here we go. Okay, so this is the channel EQ in Logic. Okay, in the middle it's got this graph display. On the horizontal we have the frequencies from 20 Hertz up to 20,000 Hertz or 20k or kilohertz, right? We know that's the limits of human hearing, 20 Hertz to 20k. Also, CDs can only reproduce and play back frequencies between 20 and 20k. So that's the frequencies we're always working between, and they're on the horizontal scale. Across the middle is the white line, that's 0, that's nothing boosted or cut. And then on the vertical we have a dB scale, how much you're boosting up from that line and how much you're cutting in dB down from that line. Right? And on this graph display you build your EQ curve. Let me build an EQ curve. Here we go. Just make a quick EQ curve here like that. Right, there's an EQ curve. An EQ curve it's called, and it's very, very simple to see what's going on. I look at this and I go, oh, well, you know, I'm boosting my bottom end here, and then I'm cutting my low mids here, and then I'm boosting my higher mids here, and then I'm boosting my high end up here. That's an EQ curve, right? And all the sequencers use this same technique. They all look like this, right? Look, check it out. This is the channel EQ in Reaper. There's the display, there's the EQ curve. This is the channel EQ in Sonar. There's the graph display, there's the EQ curve. This is the channel EQ in Pro Tools. There's the graph display and the EQ curve. This is the channel EQ in Studio One. There's the graph display with the EQ curve. And there is the channel EQ in the new Cubase 9. There's the graph display, there's the EQ curve. Right, they're all the same. Okay. Now, you have that display with the EQ curve in the middle, and then usually along the bottom is the controls to adjust the different bands of the EQ. And they're called bands because each of the bands can manipulate a band of frequencies. Hence they're called bands. All right. Now, equalizers have different amounts of bands. The simplest EQ you can have is a single band EQ. It's either fixed at a particular frequency, or you can choose its frequency and then boost or cut that frequency. Single band EQ. Up from that we have an EQ of two bands that we've all used. For example, would be the bass and treble on a hi-fi amp. You've got a bass, turn it up or down. You've got a treble, turn it up or down. Two bands, bass and treble, right? Up from there, the next simplest thing you'd have is a 3-band EQ, like on a cheap guitar amp. You got one control for the bass, turn it up or down, one control for the treble, turn it up or down, and one in the middle for the mids, turn them up or down. That's a 3-band EQ, right? And you work up from there. Now, what you would call a fully featured equalizer, like found on a top-end mixing desk or on most of all of the channel EQs from all the sequencers, a fully featured equalizer will have 6 or 7 bands, and it will always have at the bottom a low cut and a low shelf. at the top it'll have a high cut and a high shelf, and then in between the two low bands and the two high bands there'll be either 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 of these peak bands, right? And that's what you'd call a fully featured equalizer. And normally on a hardware unit, so you'd have your low cut and your low shelf, and at the top you have your high cut and your high shelf, and then there'd be 2 peak bands, and they'd be labelled low, mid and high mid. If there's 3 peak bands, they'll be called low mid, high mid and mid, etc. Right? Okay, that's the bands, right? Now each band has a different type of filter in it. Now, why are they called filters? Well, it goes back to the old days. In the old days, you only had passive equalizers, filters, and a filter can only filter out frequencies. It can only remove frequencies. It cannot boost, right? That's where it comes from. So let me just reset this. So you have different types of filters. Okay, now let me turn all these off. The simplest would be like this, a low cut filter. Remember, this comes from the days passive filters. Filters can only cut frequencies, they can't boost them. A low cut filter, we call it a low cut because it does what it says what it does on the tin, right? You know, oh, I've put the low cut on, I've cut the low end. We know it means that, but the real name of a low cut is a high pass filter, because everything higher than the cutoff frequency passes, everything lower is filtered out, right? And at the top end we have a high cut. That's what we all call it. I'll put some high cut on, everyone knows that means you've cut the high end. But its real name is a low pass filter, because everything lower than the cutoff frequency passes and everything higher is filtered out. So there's an example of 2 simple filters. They only can filter out frequencies, they can only cut. A passive filter can only cut. Okay, then we have a shelf filter, which can shelf out frequencies. Everything higher passes, everything lower is filtered down, attenuated, right? With that curve that filters out from the cut frequency all the way down to the bottom on a low shelf. And with a high shelf, right, again it's a filter, it can only cut, it can only turn down. From the cut frequency, everything higher is cut all the way up to the top from the cut frequency, right? Okay, fine. Low shelf, high shelf, they both cut with this curve like that. They're filtering out, which is all a filter can do. It can only cut, it can only filter out. Fine, that makes sense. But you're saying to yourself, well, hang on a minute, but I know that a low shelf can boost, and I know that a high shelf can boost. So if a filter can only cut, how would a passive filter do a low or high shelf boost? Well, I'm explaining this in the simplest sense, right? The absolute simplest sense. Because with passive EQs, circuits, filters, they can only cut. If you want to boost, you have to invert it and amplify it in the simplest sense, right? So if I want to do, I've got a low shelf here. Fine, simple. It's shelving off the low frequencies. It's filtering them out. It's cutting. We know a filter can only cut, can only filter out these frequencies. Everything else is left alone. But how would I do a shelf boost? Well, do it in reverse and amplify. So we get a high shelf like that, bring it all the way down to there. So it's filtering out all these frequencies. That's all it can do. It can only filter out. So it's filtering out all these frequencies and leaving this alone. Then we amplify it. All the frequencies that were reduced are re-amplified up proportional to how much they were cut. And hey presto, there's your low shelf boost, right? And it's obviously the same at the high end the other way round, right? Let's bring that back up the other way round, right? We've got a high shelf. When it's cutting, fine, filters can only cut, that makes sense, but how would we boost? Well, same thing. We do the inverse and then amplify. We get this low shelf, it's filtering out only, but we bring its frequency right up like that to a high frequency. All this is being filtered out, and then an amplifier boosts the signal back up until all the stuff being reduced is brought back up so it's no longer being reduced, and hey presto, there's our high shelf boost. Right? Again, to repeat, I'm explaining this in the simplest sense. Right? With passive EQ circuits, to boost you've got to invert what you're filtering and then amplify, right? Okay, then we've got this type of band, right, which we would call a peak band or a bell, because it's like a bell shape, right? Okay, now this is, to give it its proper name in the old, it'd be called a band pass filter, right? Because the frequencies around the center frequency, either side of it, that is a band of frequencies, and that band of frequencies around the center frequency is allowed to pass through. Everything lower and everything higher is rejected, right? Band pass. And the simplest way with passive, in the simplest sense you could create a band pass, would be to get a low cut or high pass, bring it up, and get a high cut or low pass and bring it down, and hey presto, there is a band pass. These frequencies in this center band around there are allowed to pass through. These are attenuated either side with whatever curve, right? Yeah? Again, I'm explaining this in the simplest possible sense, right? Okay, so how would it boost? Well, you would basically do, it's the kind of use the amp and invert type of thing. So what would happen is your filter would, your filter can only reduce. So you've got a filter that is filtering out everything lower than the center frequency and filtering out everything higher than the center frequency, and leaving a band of frequencies in the middle around the center frequency either side at a certain band width, like that. So this is being attenuated, this is being attenuated, and then you amp it back up to compensate, and hey presto, there's your boost, right? And to cut, you're just using a band cut like that. Again, it's a filter can only attenuate, so this band of frequencies here is being attenuated, everything else left alone, right? Look, that's just like in the simplest sense, just so you kind of get a grasp of it. But after that, then you had active EQ circuits, and with an active EQ circuit, in the simplest sense, the filters, or the filter, removes frequencies only, and then what's left is looped back into the amp, so the amp becomes frequency conscious, so to speak, and it will boost or cut a certain band of frequencies determined by what the filter is cutting out and leaving behind, right? Okay, so that is, in the simplest sense how it works, to get you to understand why these things still to this day are called filters, right? I know this is going to happen. There is going to be, obviously, someone's going to pop up in the comments and go, but the resistor, if connected to the capacitor, and then I'm just explaining this in some way that you can sort of conceptualize it and grasp it, okay? Because it's interesting to know where the name comes from, okay? So that's the different types of filters, and on all of our EQs, whether they're channel EQs in all the sequences or hardware EQs, we're really only going to ever work with these three types of filter. The cut filter, low or high. The shelving filter, low or high. And the peak or bell filter. Right? That's it. Now, just so that we kind of cover the whole thing, you may have heard of another type of filter called a notch filter, and a notch filter is an incredibly tight filter that cuts, because a filter cuts, and it's designed to notch out problem frequencies. Like, you know, you've got 60 hertz hum. You tune into it and you notch it out, and a notch filter is incredibly narrow. It just notches out a tiny little band of frequencies around the center frequency. All right, so that, you know, just so you know, because you might hear that sometimes, that's what a notch filter is, but you won't find those on EQ channels. Okay, so we're only going to work with these three filter types in our bands of our EQ, right? The cut, low or high, the shelf, low or high, shelf, high or low, and the peak or bell equalizer. Okay, and these are the icons for them internationally. So that is the high cut or low pass, and the slope goes off to the high end, down to the high end, right? This is the icon for the low cut or high pass. The slope goes down to the bass end. That is the icon for a low shelf, because the tuning fork points left to the bass end. That's the icon for a high shelf, because the tuning fork points to the right, to the high end. And this mirrored bell thing is the icon for a bell or peak equalizer. Okay. And that's it. That's the three types of filters that we're going to find in bands of our EQ, whether it's channel EQs in our sequencers or hardware EQs, or plug-in emulations of hardware EQs, older ones, right? Now, the approach for Logic is to offer you 8 total bands, and in each band there is a fixed filter type that cannot be changed. But in some other channel EQs, and particularly in more better hardware EQs, sometimes you'll have the option to switch a band between different filter types, and that normally only happens with the high and low shelf and the high and low cut. Normally the peaks, they're just peaks, that's what they are. You can't switch them. And to show, so Logic offers us 8 bands, each one fixed to a filter type, but other sequencers do it differently. In Reaper, and I've never used it, but looking at the picture you can see there are 7 bands. Band 5 is selected, and below there's a drop down list where you can choose what type of filter goes in that band. Then you've got 3 controls: frequency to choose the frequency, gain to boost or cut, and bandwidth, which we'll come to in a minute. And then this is Sonar. It's a 6-band EQ. There's your high pass or low cut, there's your low pass or high cut, and then you've got 4 bands in between: low shelf, high shelf, and 2 peak equalizer bands. But the low shelf and high shelf can be switched to peak. That would give you 4 peak in total. Okay, Pro Tools next. Low cut, high cut, but this is not that usual. The high and low cut can be switched from the usual roll off to a dip type cut, right? Okay, so that's your high and low cut, and then there's your low shelf, there's your high shelf. They can both be switched to peak, and in between 3 peak bands that are just fixed as peak bands. Next, Studio One. Okay, you've got your low cut there, your high cut there. There's your 3 peak bands in the middle, top and these 2. There's your low shelf, there's your high shelf. Both of the shelves can be switched between shelf or peak. And finally, Cubase takes an open-ended approach. 8 bands, and each one has a drop-down list you can just see. So you can activate any of the 8 bands, drop the list down, and assign a different type of filter to the bands, right? Okay, so that's how it goes. So bands, and they have different types of filters in, and we know why they're called filters, right? Okay, now let's look at those 3 filter types in detail, starting with the cut, low and high cut, high pass, low pass. Now you assign it to a frequency. Let's put it to 100 hertz for this low cut or high pass as it's properly known. And the frequencies are they roll off like this. This is called the roll off or the slope, right? And they roll off and keep rolling off all the way down, right? And the steepness of that roll off or slope can be adjusted. Sometimes it's fixed, like on a hardware equalizer, it will be fixed. You won't be able to adjust that roll off steepness. It'll be fixed by the designer. But on these channel EQs, you can usually change it. Change the steepness of the roll off or slope, right? And the parameter to do that is called the dB octave value. And you'll see that the higher the dB octave value, the steeper the slope. And the lower the dB octave value, the shallower the slope. Right, now what is this dB octave? Well, frequencies have a pitch. Check it out. That is a frequency to pitch chart. Let's check out the A row here. Right, see along there, A, and most people, look at the A4 there. Most people know or have heard that centre A on a piano has a pitch of 440 Hertz. There it is, right? If we go down an octave from that to A3, we just half the frequency, 220 Hertz. Go down another octave, we half again, 110 Hertz. Go down another octave, we half again, 55 Hertz, and working up the other way, we just double. So A4, 440 Hertz. Go up from that, we double to 880 Hertz, an octave up. Go up another octave, we double again to 1760, etc. Right? So that's your octaves. So I've put this low cut or high pass at a cut-off frequency of 100 Hertz. And if I set it to 24 dB an octave, that means that an octave down from 100 Hertz, 50 Hertz, if I follow that 50 Hertz line down, that is how much reduction has occurred an octave down from the cut frequency of 100 Hertz. And if we follow it across, it's 24 dB, just there between 20 and 30, right? If I set it to something shallower, 12 dB an octave, we go down an octave to 50 Hertz, follow the line down, that is how much it's cut an octave down. Follow it across, 12 dB of cut. And if we go with 6 dB an octave, very, very gentle slope, down an octave from the cut frequency, 50 Hertz, that's how much we've cut an octave down. Follow it across, 6 dB of cut, just below 5, right? So that determines the steepness of the slope, the dB octave value. Now there's something else you'll notice, that I've got this set to 100 Hertz for the cut-off frequency. It doesn't like come along like down the frequencies, down the frequencies, down the frequencies, nothing happens, and suddenly at 100 Hertz, coming off in a vertical line, it drops off there into a curve, because it would sound completely unnatural, right? So that cut frequency, the beginning of the roll off, the beginning of that drop away to lower, begins higher up than the cut frequency, right, to go into that slope. And the steeper the dB octave slope, the closer to the cut frequency that beginning of that attenuation begins. So the cut frequency acts as like a pivot, and the S shape pivots around it depending on, you know, further away or closer, depending on the dB octave value. Right? Okay. At the other end, it's exactly the same but in reverse. There's my high cut or low pass. Let's put it to 5K, like that. And if I put it to 24 dB an octave, then an octave up from 5K is 10K. Follow the 10K line down. There we go. Look, an octave up, it's reduced by 24 dB. Follow that line across, 24 dB of reduction. Put it to 12 dB an octave up from 5K, 10K, follow the line down, it's work across, it's reduced by 12 dB an octave up. And finally, at 6 dB an octave, the gentlest slope, up from 5K an octave, 10k, follow the line down. That's how much it's cut an octave higher. Follow it across. 6 dB of reduction, just below 5. Right. So that is the dB octave thing explained. And as I say, the cut-off frequency acts as a pivot around which the S shape sort of rotates, steeper, shallower, like that. Okay, that's your high and low cut, or low pass and high pass. Okay, next, the shelving filters. We have a low and high shelf. They can boost or cut. Boost or cut, right? Now, the thing about a shelving filter is you choose a frequency for it, like the cutoff frequency. I'll put this to 100 Hertz. On the low shelf, when it cuts all the frequencies from that cutoff frequency all the way down to the bottom. When it boosts all the frequencies from the cut frequency all the way down to the bottom. And so the same the other way around with the high shelf. I've got it on at 5k. When I boost, it boosts from 5k all the way up from there to the top. And when I cut, it cuts from 5k all the way up from there to the top, all frequencies, right? But the thing about a shelving filter is whether it's boosting or cutting, the curve doesn't sort of come up like that and then just keep on boosting, or it doesn't cut and this doesn't curve down and just keep on reducing. Whether it's boosting or cutting, it boosts up, and the boost begins before the cutoff frequency, right? And roughly an octave below, it flattens out into a flat shelf like that. So all frequencies from roughly an octave further down than the cut frequency are being boosted at exactly the same amount. And when it's cutting, it does the same back to front. And roughly an octave down, the curve flattens out, and all frequencies from there on are being cut the same amount right down to the bottom. And with the top end, it's the same the other way round. If I do a boost, 5k, roughly an octave up at 10k, the line flattens out, the curve flattens out. It doesn't keep on going uphill, cutting more, boosting more and more. So everything from roughly an octave up is being boosted the same amount. And when I cut with it, 5k, and roughly an octave above, the line flattens out. So it's called a shelving a shelf because it curves up like this and then flattens out into a shelf, whether it's boosting or cutting. Now, the simplest type of shelf EQ that we've all used is the bass and treble on a hi-fi amp. Okay, and they're kind of higher up, centered at around 1k like that roughly. Right, so you turn up the treble or cut the treble. You turn up the bass or cut the bass. Right, that's the simplest type of pair of shelving filters most of us or most people have used, right? Bass, turn it up, turn it down. Treble, turn it up, turn it down. But whilst that is partially true, it is a shelving type filter in that when you boost or cut the bass end, it boosts all the way down or cuts all the way down. And when you boost or cut the top end, it boosts all the way up or cuts all the way up. It has a completely different curve on a hi-fi amp, right? This shelving type curve flattens out whether it's boosting or cutting. But on a hi-fi amp, it's a totally different kind of curve. Let's just look at that because, you know, the whole point of this is you want to learn about EQ and equalizers, so it's good to be able to know these different little things so you can have a conversation about it, all right? So on a hi-fi amp, it's a different curve. And it's called the Baxandall curve, right? And that is a Baxandall curve, right? It's different. Now, look, you might look at this and think, well, it isn't different. Look, the curve goes up and then it flattens out there. And the curve goes down and it flattens out there. And at the top end here, the curve goes up and flattens out. The curve comes down and flattens out. That's not a flattening out as part of the filter design. Like on a high and low shelf, this flattens out, but there's nowhere near. I'm not up at the top of boost. I'm only boosting it like a little bit, but it still flattens out. I'm only cutting a little bit, but it still flattens out. What you're seeing is where it flattens out there, that is just the maximum. It can't boost anymore. So it hits a top there. It can't boost anymore. At the bottom, it can't cut anymore. Same down with the low here. the bass. It can't cut anymore, it can't boost anymore. So it doesn't flatten out. If you look, when you cut, the curve just keeps on cutting. The further down the frequencies it goes. So when you boost, the curve just keeps on boosting the further down the frequencies you go. And at the top end, when you boost, the curve just keeps on boosting more and more and more the higher up the frequencies you go. And when you cut, the curve just keeps on cutting the higher and higher up the frequencies you go. And this is called a Baxandall EQ curve on the bass and treble. And it's called that because it comes from this guy, Peter Baxandall. And in the 50s, he designed this wonderful little EQ circuit that could boost or cut treble or bass, right? And it was very well received. It was very, very musical. And it was published in some big electronics magazine, you know, and it won awards, I think, and it ended up being put in pretty much every hi-fi amp in the world, right? You know, it's standard bass and treble, right? But he'll always be known as the guy that invented it. Now, why is it such a musical curve? This goes back to the previous video when we talked about how we hear frequencies at different volumes. We don't hear these look, from 5K up, we hear the frequencies less and less and less and less and less. And then the other way, coming down, from around 500 hertz, we hear the bass frequencies less and less, and then into the real bass frequencies less and less and less and less. It dies away. The deeper it goes, we hear them less. The higher up we go, they die away. We hear them less. So the point of this curve is that if I turn the bass control on my hi-fi amp down just a little bit, the frequencies around the mids and then working into the low mids here, they're hardly turned down at all. They're hardly touched. But right at the real bottom end, it's turned down all the way. A hell of a lot. So the effect is, as if I turn the bass control down a little on my hi-fi amp, I hear the deep bass turned down, but working up from there, I'd hear not much reduction at all, nothing. And if I boost the bass just a little, I hear the real deep bottom end boost a lot, but working up from there, proportionately less and less and less. So I don't turn up the bass a little and hear the really deep bass turn up and the mid turn up and the higher mid turn up all the same amount. Only the deep bass gets the most and less working up from there. So it sounds more natural. All right. So whether you cut or boost the bass, the more you cut or boost, the more and more and more it starts to work up the frequencies to start cutting or boosting more and more up into the low mids, more and more up into the mids, which sounds natural. It's a natural curve, and that's because we don't hear these frequencies down here very loudly, so it boosts or cuts them the most. And at the other end, it's the same in reverse. We don't hear these frequencies up here very much. We don't hear them very loud. So that when you boost a little bit of treble, it boosts the real top end that we don't hear very loud really a lot. So we perceive that top end going up, but working down into the frequencies you do hear, they hardly move at all. The more and more you boost, the more down the frequencies they get boosted. And when you're cutting, it's the same in reverse. When you cut the treble a little, you hear just the top end cut, but around here, nothing. Cut more working down starts being cut, and then cut extremely, and even more working down into the mid area gets cut. So it just sounds more musical. It's balanced to how our ears react. There you go. That's a Baxandall EQ curve. Look, it's just interesting to know this stuff, right? And this is how a shelf is different. A shelf comes down or goes up and flattens out. Okay. Alrighty, that leaves these peak bands, or bells, some people call them. I'm just going to call them peak from now on. Okay, now a peak band. You can choose its frequency. And then you boost or cut, and you're cutting a band of frequencies around the center frequency, either side of that, right? And the width of that band of frequencies that you're adjusting is called the bandwidth, or the Q. How far out from the center frequency will frequencies be affected when you boost or cut? Will frequencies working well up and well down from that be cut or boosted? or will it be much tighter? Right? That's called the bandwidth. Now, often this is fixed by the circuit designer, right? And you can't adjust it. But one thing about these peak bands is that often they'll have something called proportional Q. And that means that the more you boost, look at the edges coming in, it's getting tighter and tighter and narrower and peakier. And then you turn down the boost and it widens out, it becomes more soft. And then when you cut a little, it's quite wide and soft, but the more you cut, the tighter it gets, the peakier it gets. And that is called proportional Q. Most peak band EQs are proportional, right? Okay. Now, where you'll see this type of peak band would be on a typical mixer, right? And it might be a mid, assigned to the mid-range frequencies, which means that in the circuitry it's restricted. It can only sort of move. It can only select frequencies between, say, 200 hertz and 2K or something, right? And then on a mixer where you see this type of equalizer filter, there'll be two controls, one labelled frequency and one labelled gain, or it'll just have a plus and minus symbol on the clockwise and counterclockwise, right, to boost or cut. Just two controls. And when you see it like that with just two controls and it's fixed to a particular band of frequencies, maybe, it doesn't have to be, but usually it is, like the mid-range frequencies or something, then you can get that frequency control and you can sweep up and down the available range of frequencies for that band, tune into a particular frequency, and then use the other control to boost or cut. So when it's like that with two controls, it's commonly referred to as a sweep equalizer, because you can sweep the frequencies, choose a frequency, and then cut or boost, right? But sometimes it will have a third control called Q, or bandwidth, and that allows you to actually adjust the width of the band of frequencies that you're going to be cutting or boosting. And if it's got that third control where you can adjust the bandwidth, then it's called a parametric. Right? And George Massenburg invented the parametric, as far as I know. I think he first proposed it, and I think he built the first one. Okay, but look, even if your peak equalizer has the third Q control to adjust the bandwidth, it can still have proportional Q, right? You adjust the bandwidth from the get-go, narrower or wider, but it still gets peakier the more you boost or the more you cut, right? Okay, all right. So that is your peak band EQ. And that's the only three bands that we're going to see on EQs that we use, really. Okay, there is another type of EQ called a notch EQ, but I explained that already, didn't I? All right, so we're always going to be, all mixers have these three types of bands. All your channel EQs and your software sequencers have these three bands, and hardware EQs have those bands. That's all you'll see on them, right? Okay, so there you go. That's some stuff explained, right?
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
Interesting stuff in it. Now, look, there is one other type of equalizer that's common. Let's look at it, because you want to learn all this stuff, right? Ka-ching! There we go. Ooh, look at that. Now, this is an Ashley. That's the manufacturer. An Ashley 2-channel 31-band graphic equalizer. You can get them in single channel form. But this was a good big picture where you can really see the detail. Okay, let me zoom in even more. Okay, this is a 31-band graphic, and it is referred to, with 31 bands like that, it is referred to as a third of an octave graphic equalizer. And the reason is, again, referring back to, remember, we've got, not the hipsters, we've got octaves in frequencies, right? So it's called a third of an octave graphic equalizer because there are 3 sliders, 3 volume controls, 3 faders between each octave. And it goes from the full range from 20 Hz all the way up to 20,000 Hz or 20K. Okay, so 3 bands between each octave. Let's start at the bottom, 20 Hz. We go up 1, 2, 3. We've doubled the frequency to 40 Hz. We're an octave up. Okay, let's go up to the next octave. 1, 2, 3, 80 Hz. Next octave. 1, 2, 3, 160 Hz. Yeah, see? Easy, right? Next octave up from 160 Hz should be 320 Hz. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Hang on, but it's only 315 Hz, not 320. And the reason for that is this is an ISO standard third of an octave graphic equalizer. The octaves are decided by ISO standard, and when it's ISO standard, a calculus is used to derive the octaves, and using that calculation, doubling 160 does not come out at 320. It comes out something like 314 point something Hertz. So octave up from 160 is 315 Hertz. Okay, let's go up an octave from there. 1, 2, 3, 630, double 315. Then we go up another octave from 630, and again there's a slight change. It doesn't double. Go up from 630, we should get 1260, but we don't. Look, watch, we get 1, 2, 3, 1250, or 1.25k. 1250, right? Again, it's due to the calculus. It rounds it. The calculus brings it out nearer to 1250, nearer than it comes to 1260. So up from 630, 1, 2, 3, we get 1.25k. Then we got 1, 2, 3, 2.5k. We've doubled 1.25k. We're back on the doubling again. Up an octave from 2.5k, 1, 2, 3, 5k, up an octave again, 1, 2, 3, 10k, up an octave again, 1, 2, 3, and hurrah, 20k, we're at the top. Doubled. Okay, so this is a 31 band graphic with ISO third of an octave intervals. Now you would not use this type of equalizer to mix on channels or anything. An equalizer like this is used to set EQ curves to compensate, usually it's used to compensate for how a hall at a gig or a room at a gig is, what its frequency response is like. So if the room booms around here to 250 Hertz, you would dip that out on the graphic for the left and right main speaker mix that the audience hears. Or if the room is terribly dead and has got no treble end, you will boost up some treble on the left and right here or something. Or you'll use one side on to balance the signal going to the wedge monitors along the front of the stage, and the other side to balance the signal going to the stage fills, which is like 2 mini PA speaker stacks pointing in at each side of the stage to the band. Again, if there are resonant frequency problems on the stage in different frequency areas, you can dip those out to prevent feedback, things like that, right? So this is a corrective type thing, usually almost exclusively used for live work. You won't see a graphic used much in the studio. All right, okay, but look, we're learning all this stuff, so it's interesting to know, right? And you know this now, you can have a conversation about it, right? Okay. Okay, so that's all your groundwork about equalizers. Okay, why they have bands and what the different filters are in those bands and everything like that. Now, all the software sequencers all have the same type of channel EQ, right? And as I've explained, some of them, the filters in each band are fixed, and some of them they can be switched. There are other types of equalizer though, and those are hardware equalizers. But we're going to look at them in plug-in form as emulations because it's a lot easier than getting a camera out, right? But real equalizers, like here's a copy, an emulation of a Neve 1073 equalizer, right? But as I said, we're always working with those same filter types. There's your low shelf. There's your high shelf. There's your peak band. And there's a low cut, right? Or here's a Neve 1081 clone, right? Yeah. There's your high shelf. There's your low shelf. There's your two mids, mid 1, mid 2. But on this one, the high shelf and the low shelf can be switched into peak mode. Yeah, as I said, in hardware and software form, often the low shelf and high shelf can be switched to peak. And there's your two mids, mid 1, mid 2, and they can be switched into high Q. They have a fixed Q, and they've got proportional Q, these mids actually, but they can be switched to high Q, and that's the equivalent of you getting the mid, which is a peak band, and it's got proportional Q. It's going to tighten up when you boost or cut, but you're tightening it up from the get-go, right? That kind of thing, right? And it's got a low and high cut here. Okay, so there's different EQs like that. And the other thing about these kind of EQs is with our channel EQs, whether we're using the high cut, the low and high shelf, or any of the peak bands, we've always got this thing where we can constantly choose any frequency we want, sweeping up and down, right? But the other feature about these hardware type EQs is that, especially with the older ones, they are switching EQs. You cannot, there's the mid frequency selector, and that's the boost or cut for it. You can't sweep up and down the frequencies and choose any frequency you want. They're fixed, and you can only switch between the ones that you can choose, the frequencies that are available to choose from. Same with the low. It's a low shelf, but you can't choose any frequency for the low. You switch between them. So a lot, especially with the older EQs, these are switching EQs, right? So that's another thing that's different. Okay, so look, that's equalizers. Now we'll come back to those switching EQs, because what we're going to do next is I'm going to take a little break, have a cup of tea, and then we'll come back and we're going to talk about the two different stages of a mix, because there's two extremely different stages of a mix, and the difference in the qualities of these type of completely open-ended channel EQs that are in all the sequences where you can choose any damn frequency you want, right? For any of the bands, you can choose any width of Q that you want. You can boost and cut huge amounts, etc., etc., right? There's a difference between these kind of EQs and these emulations of old EQs, right? So, and either of them are good at different stages of the mix. So I'll have a little break, then we'll come back and I'll just explain to you the two stages of the mix, and then we'll have a look at a variety of these old classic EQs and hear them in action and see what kind of thing they do. Okay? And then you'll really get it then. All right, I'll have a cup of tea now.